heads up. So we have a new report out from an insider to a significant extent about leverage research, which is one of the weird sort of effective altruist, long-termist organizations that I've been quite interested in for a long time. I write about it in my book about Sam Bankman-Fried. It's sort of adjacent. And it's a very weird organization. And this new report sort of confirms a lot of the weirdness and, in fact, expands on it. Specifically, we have a lot of alternative sort of healing practices going on in this supposedly rationalist environment. And we have a lot more evidence of close connections to the far right and to the sort of neo-reactionary movement in this supposedly sort of effective altruist, rationalist aligned organization where they sort of purport to not have anything to do with that. So there's a lot to talk about. Just a quick sort of recap. A lot of what we knew about leverage research up to this point, or at least about the internals of it, was from this woman, Zoe Kersey, who is a former researcher there and who talked about having like serious long-term psychological effects, essentially trauma responses from some of the practices there. And very broadly, what we got from her description, I think, was something kind of close to Scientology at the core of leverage research. They were doing sort of group therapy sessions where they were doing like critique sessions. They were talking about this idea that they were infecting each other with psychological demons, a lot of weird stuff going on. What this new one adds, and the author's name is, I should say this up front, um, Laura, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting, um, Lawrenson, Lydia Lawrenson. Okay, and some of you might recognize that name. So this report on leverage research from Lydia Lawrenson. Lydia Lawrenson was briefly dating Curtis Yarvin, so the right-wing sort of dark intellectual guy. They apparently conceived a child. It's unclear exactly what happened there, but there was a lot of legal fallout. Apparently, Lawrenson was like a main character for a little while after she started talking about having been with Curtis Yarvin. But the long and short of it is this person is very embedded, and we'll get into it. But she was originally going to be writing this for New York Magazine, and that fell through. And my interpretation of a lot of what she's said is that she was not able to be sort of objective about the stuff that she's writing about. And we'll get into that. And there's also some fascinating stuff about conflict of interest that she seems to have gotten herself tangled into here that she doesn't seem to be aware of. But the sort of most immediately sort of sensationalist thing that she talks about is the really major role that laying on of hands seems to have played in this sort of rationalist scientific organization. So there was a lot of this like touch therapy going on and people experiencing these like weird kind of magical quote unquote effects. I'm going to quote one of the passages from Lawrenson's piece. Emily, one of the people she writes about, who is a member of Leverage Research, Emily increasingly found herself enduring bizarre side effects like headaches or crippling anxiety after body work is what they call it, body work experiments. She noticed that others had frequent after effects too. The word emergency was becoming common as it was used when an employee of Leverage, was in an extremely bad state, screaming or convulsing, for example, and then required hours or days of help. I find this fascinating because this is just, body work being like touching people while they're laying on a table. And they're triggering these huge psychological events, which to me really speaks to cult indoctrination, that you have this kind of innocuous or at best like subtle effects. I mean, whether or not you believe in Reiki, it's a very subtle effect. But instead, these people are having freakouts. They're having psychological breakdowns. This is a group of people who are very suggestible, is one of the things that I take away here. You've got very suggestible people doing weird woo-woo stuff to each other and then experiencing amazing impacts, which I have to say is really similar to the way that these people perceive AI. They're very credulous. They're very easily swayed. And by the way, I'm seeing some notes here. This is just a little bit too far away for me to see the notes while I'm talking on the phone, so I'm not going to be able to engage with notes today, unfortunately. Um, Another interesting note that she talks about is there's housing at Leverage Research in a room full of bunk beds that they referred to as the barracks. This I take as a really subtle hint of the high control nature of this organization, that they were sort of putting people in a barracks. You're supposed to be uniforms. You're supposed to be like on program, let's say. Another very common tactic of depersonalization, de-individualization in these high control slash cult groups. Um, and again, she talks about, as I mentioned, the high presence of these far right figures. So, in particular, I actually looks like I've got the name wrong here, but Wolf Tinney or Tivy, Wolf Tivy, publisher of this thing called Palladium Magazine, which is a somewhat well-known right-wing Bay Area publication. Wolf Tivy was apparently an employee of Leverage Research for a time, which I think also gives a clue into the sort of nature of Peter Thiel's funding. So a lot of funding for this came from Peter Thiel and also from Yan Talon, which will become important. But essentially, my read is that this was to some extent like a full employment program for far right people, which again, very weird when you have been paying attention to effective altruism and they're very focused on the fact that they're like center left ish liberals, quote unquote, when in fact this stuff was all sort of neoliberal, neo reactionary all the way down the entire time. And I've written quite a bit about uh, I've written quite, and again, sorry, I can't quite read the comments. I'm a little bit too hard of seeing to see this far. Um, but yeah, it's interesting. Basically, the mask has been ripped off. As I've written about, utilitarianism itself is inherently super authoritarianism because it is based on the idea that you can like know what somebody else should do, basically, for their best outcome. So all of this is getting unpacked time after time. Now, the real like sort of authoritarian cult element of this comes from um, Geoff Anders, the leader of Leverage. I really need to find out more about him. He seems like a very strange and interesting person, but essentially he believes that he is much like Yudkowsky, Eliezer Yudkowsky believes that he is this like unique world historical intellect. Geoff Anders believes that he is this unique world historical intellect. And he Lawrence, in her piece, describes the process of him kind of writing this down as one of his goals. He had, at a very young age, this like list of goals, including the first step of Geoff Anders' life plan was, quote, answer all philosophical questions. Um, as I point out in my response, this is just like childish silliness. Like, who on earth even, it's a grand ambition. It's great, but who seriously writes down, my first life goal is to answer all philosophical questions, and then we're going to go from there. Like, one of the reasons that these people are so susceptible to tech hype is that they are just simple minded. They don't understand the real nature of complexity or the sort of fact that the world has a lot going on. They think that they can just solve all philosophical questions. And that level of ambition is great, but like to seriously believe that that's the way you're going to live your life or that you're going to like make that contribution is just, you're setting yourself up for tragedy. And of course, in Geoff Anders' case, that's pretty much what happened. His organization has had all of these reported psychological breaks, really bad stuff happening to some people, including one alleged suicide that was a result of the stuff that he was teaching at Leverage Research. And now there is this like Leverage 2.0, which is a much smaller, more diffuse, seemingly less funded organization because what he did led people to get hurt. Um, the other things that she reveals about Geoff Anders, which I think are very interesting, is he was directly inspired by Isaac Asimov's Foundation series, and specifically the idea of psychohistory. Again, this is something that I write about in my book as sort of having parallels with the way that effective altruists think. So it's really striking to see a specific reference to it, which I had actually not seen before. So psychohistory, for those who don't know, is this idea that you can basically do math about the social decision-making process and figure out where history is going to go in the future. And it's science fiction. But like so many of the things in this world, these technologists looked at science fiction. And by the way, Asimov himself admits that this is like not really something that works even within the universe, but that gets left by the wayside, of course. the problem or so it's just people taking science fiction at face value rather than science fiction as a way of working out problems, in human society. Um, Anders' core idea, the basis of leverage research's sort of excuse for existing, is what he called connection theory, which he argued was this sort of like single solution to human psychology. And that's where you always, whether it's a financial fraud or a cult or anything like that, anybody who claims to have one answer, that's a fraud, it's a cult. In this case, connection theory, as explained by Lawrenson, was a theory of belief and behavior that postulates that people have basic goals and act for the sake of achieving those basic goals. I mean, you can sort of tell right from the start that, like, there's no profound insight here. This is just sort of basic stuff. And it's important to point out that nobody, including Anders, who's an analytic philosopher, I won't get into what that means, but it's the furthest possible thing from being somebody who's a specialist in psychology. All of these people have no training in psychology, in, sociology. These are all engineers. They are analytic philosophers. They have sort of this reductive viewpoint, that is just sort of the way that they try and address problems. Um, Now, I want to get into, finally, or as we get into, yeah, let's sort of start winding down, because those are sort of the most interesting things about leverage. But the story about how Lydia Lawrenson wrote this story is itself, I think, quite interesting. And I want to just go with a couple of quotes, because she did have this initially commissioned by New York Magazine. And by the way, if you haven't looked, you can just look at Dark Markets and you'll find this as the top essay. This is the most recent thing I published, was a commentary on Lydia Lawrenson's report. So she initially had this piece commissioned by New York Magazine. She writes at some length in a separate post about why that didn't actually wind up being where it was published, but ultimately what it boils down to is this was not up to snuff for an actual feature in a legitimate publication, and so she didn't wind up publishing it with New York Mag. I want two quotes here. This is from Lydia Lawrence in the author's piece. Quote, "There are huge framing differences between the mainstream media and the communities from which leverage emerged." End quote. So what that's saying is she wanted to publish a piece that represented the community's perspective on all of this, the community's perspective on laying on of hands and giving people seizures, which, by the way, in her actual write-up, both that and the long-term psychological damage that some of the people she's writing about suffered, she kind of brushes it off. She doesn't really ask hard questions about what's going on. And that gets to the heart of why New York Magazine would not have wanted to publish this thing. It's unpublishable by a real magazine in its current form, because it's just this very neutral representation of some very weird stuff that the readers of New York Magazine would have wanted acknowledged, would have expected a writer to acknowledge as, this is pretty damn weird. You're giving people seizures by doing Reiki to them. What's going on? This seems like a cult. And of course, Lawrenson doesn't have that perspective because she's still kind of inside the bubble there. She basically still seems to think everybody was doing stuff that was just fine here. And it's kind of an interesting slash maybe unfortunate series of events that led to people getting hurt. And she does this at the end of her piece. She's like, okay, where are people now? She did a very neutral rundown of the current status of leverage research. She basically still seems to believe that they have some like psychological breakthrough that's going to help people make better decisions. The other thing that she said about working with New York Magazine was, quote, "I started feeling like it simply wouldn't be possible for me to publish a version with New York Mag that didn't carry a subtle hostility towards leverage." That is to say, she sounds like she was getting pressure from her publisher or editor at New York Mag to be like, be a little more critical, maybe ask some questions that might occur to people who aren't literally aligned with this cult. And she was like, you know what? I'd rather not do that. I'd rather not ask those questions. And here's where we get to the craziest part of this story that I think is the most revealing of kind of the problems with how rationalists or EAs or all of these Silicon Valley ideologues think about anything. So she couldn't publish this piece with New York Mag. She's like, I'm out. And by the way, the other thing is really hilarious. The version that she puts it out here is 14,000 words. It's way too long. Like, it probably would have been maybe at most an 8,000 word piece is, I think, the longest that New York Magazine publishes. It took her, according to her, it took her 2.5 years to write this 14,000 word piece. I wrote my entire book in 9 months, people. This is not like a a hard worker, maybe is one way to put it, or somebody who really had a hard time producing this piece. Um, but what happens after she bails out? Well, she says, I still want to do fact checking on this thing, even though I'm going to publish it on my own Substack, right? So where does she go? She goes to Survival and Flourishing. And some of you will already know what I'm going to get to here. They give her a grant, which to some extent is a retroactive grant, according to her, for work that she had already done. She got a grant of $35,000 for this blog post, which is so representative of all the fucked up shit that happens in this scope of whether you're talking about like Peter Thiel giving Eliza Yudkowsky $1 million to run his blog. These are all just like financial incentives for people to do ideological work on behalf of techno-fascism. Let's just put that out there. She is getting paid $35,000 to write this blog post. It's a fairly neutral account based on having friendly interviews, by the way, with Geoff Anders himself. Instead of complying with New York Magazine's ask that she like maybe write something that's a little bit more critical. And so that's how you end up with this insular community of people writing about how great each other is. And $35,000, by the way, is so much more money than you would have gotten for a feature for New York Mag. I mean, I don't know. I've actually never written at feature length for New York Mag, but maybe these days you would get like maximum 10 grand for like a feature length story in even a print magazine like that. Like, I'm sure you can go higher from that, but she's like a new writer, so wouldn't have a lot of bargaining power. So she got like 3 or 4 times maybe what she would have gotten for writing a real magazine article to instead write something that flatters the people that she's writing about, literally funded by the people she's writing about. I apologize. It's still summer, so I get coughs here. Um, because, and I haven't said this yet, Yan Talon was one of the funders of Survival and Flourishing, the grant program. Yan Talon, founder of Kazaa and I believe also Skype, is also one of the funders of this cult of leverage research. So Jan Talon funds leverage research. Lydia, what's her name, writes about leverage research. Jan Talon gives Lydia, what's her name, money to write about leverage research. So it's all just a closed circle. It's all people just paying each other to write about how great they are. And it just drives me insane, frankly. Um, it drives me extra insane for one thing, because this Lydia Lawrenson person also is like complaining about the state of journalism, by the way, because of her own, frankly, insane perceptions of Black Lives Matter, specifically going back to 2020, where she's citing in her piece about why she doesn't trust journalism anymore as like kind of half of her excuse for not publishing this with New York Magazine. She's citing Michael Tracy's coverage of the Black Lives Matter protests, which she, by the way, consistently describes as riots. And, I went and looked back at some of Michael Tracy's coverage, and predictably, Michael Tracy is like a nut job who's just ginning up fear. And he shows a bunch of pictures of boarded up stores in towns where there were Black Lives Matter demonstrations, which he, like Lawrenson, refers to as riots. He claims to be showing all this property damage. There's no property damage in the stuff that he's showing. There are boarded up windows, which, by the way, happened here in New York too, where there were, street protests going on. And by the way, you can't call stuff anyway. I won't debate the sort of nature of property destruction as a claim of like violence in the streets. I think it's stupid and cowardly, frankly, and driven by racism. But that's just me. So anyway, this is how she was like radicalized into the far right, was basically racial paranoia, is my take. And so that's kind of the long story here, is that somebody who was scared out of doing real reporting and instead got paid by the people she was writing about, uses as her excuse for not wanting to write a real journalistic article that she was scared of the Black Lives Matter quote unquote riots and saw it as like unfair that the mainstream media or like distortion that the mainstream media covered those demonstrations as political demonstrations instead of as violent riots, which is how her, scared mind perceived them. Um, and also, she cites the Hunter Biden laptop story, which I don't have a real take on that, whether that censorship was good, but it certainly gives you a good sense of where she's coming from. So, long story short, this is a person who was paid by a techno oligarch to write a essentially limited hangout story about one of the techno utopian cults that this billionaire Jan Tallon, along with Peter Thiel, helped fund. That seems to be like driving young people insane by doing Reiki to them. Um, it couldn't be more absurd if you made it up. I think what I have to do here is write like some fiction about this because it's so bizarre. You can't even really wrap your head around it in a nonfiction context. I do have there are a few people here, by the way. Thanks everybody for showing up. I don't. I have a couple minutes. If somebody wants to drop like a question or two, I could maybe try and answer. But otherwise, I think we're just about done here. Again, I think that my main takeaway is that there is just a lot of pay for play that these people do not seem to understand as a source of conflict of interest and a reason that like their take is not legitimate. I mean, the reason New York Magazine did not want to publish this article is because it's defensive of a cult that is hurting people. And I don't know any other way to put it more directly than that. And Lawrenson just does not want to accept that she is playing defense for, I'm just gonna say, like, probably kind of very misguided people at best. And I think frankly, people who are being used for bad ends by people with bad intentions. There's a lot to get into about the sort of intellectual flimsiness of a lot of this. Um, but I have to go and do some real work. So thanks everybody for logging on. I'm always impressed that I can just pop on here and there's a couple dozen people. And then this video goes out and gets to spread around a little bit more. And we're continuing to grow. I will try and do this on a more scheduled basis going forward. So, but thanks for people for popping in here. It's great that I can just drop in and say a few things. So thanks everybody, and look out for more next week. Take care. I got to figure out how to end this now. You're gonna get to see the real awkwardness. How do I log out? There we go. Take care.